Okay, welcome back to the House Environment Committee. We're going to continue taking testimony on a proposed amendment to S223.
Great. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on this amendment. For the record, my name is John Groveman. I'm the Policy and Water Program Director for the Vermont Natural Resources Council. And just as a background that kind of informs my testimony on these issues, I was A&R General Counsel for about 4 years, worked on these issues inside the agency. So I have a lot of insight into how the Wetland Division works and how these issues come up. I also served in the early 2000s as the director of the Water Resources Board, which at that point had, they were the entity that actually promulgated the wetland rules. And so they had the authority basically over wetlands rulemaking and policy in the state. And we actually, the board heard petitions for reclassification, for adjustments to buffers. And so I have a lot of experience with those issues. So I testified, I think it was at the very beginning of the session it was on the governor's EO. And at that point, I spent a fair amount of time just talking about the importance of wetlands. I'm not going to do that right now, but I just want to remind people, and I think you get it because I'm just listening to the conversation. But wetlands, I'll just do a few sentences to say, wetlands are, really one of our most important ecological resources. They are nature's way of holding back floodwater, of reducing erosion. They slow water when we do get the intense rain events that the committee's been talking about. That's naturally what they do. The water goes into the wetland and it's held there and then released more slowly. And it filters out pollutants. So the water quality damage that is done as a result of intense rain events would be much worse if we didn't have wetlands. And I'll just use, as an example, one of the things I've worked on over the years where really I think is a great example in Vermont of what happens when you allow wetlands to be filled and functions to be eliminated, those type of functions I just mentioned, or diminished is Chittenden County. In the 90s, early 2000s, when we were dealing with all the stormwater impaired waters. Does everyone remember that? Like that was the big crisis of the day before we even were at the Lake Champlain TMDL stage of things. We had all these waters in Chittenden County because there was so much development there. There was not stormwater control, but also there were wetlands filled all over the place. And I remember walking around and doing site visits with, with A&R, with municipalities, with EPA. And we talked about, if we can go back in time and not develop in that way and not fill the wetlands and work around them and use the natural landscape to protect water quality, we may not have been in the bind we were. It cost us tens of millions of dollars to restore those waters in Chittenden County. And those were, in a lot of them, in and around the growth areas where this would apply. So I just I think that's an instructive way to think about this and what the risks are. I think the conversation the committee's been having about risks is a good one. So I really kind of want to orient the committee towards the significance of this amendment. And I want to start with the point that this is a major departure from our wetland statute, a major departure. This is not a small thing. It's not a small thing because it's only going to apply to wetlands in certain areas. It's not a small thing because it's time limited. And the reason that I say that is because if you look at the existing wetland statute, the purpose of the statute that's been in place since 1990 is to protect and restore wetlands. So Vermont achieves a net gain of wetlands, and we added the net gain part a couple of years ago, but the other part was already there. Previously, it said no net loss, and we went to net gain. And then the statute now says regulation and management of the water resources of Vermont, including wetlands, should be guided by science, and activities in water resources and wetlands should have a net environmental benefit to the state. And I want to focus on the and that's, I think, one of the reasons this is such a big departure in the statute is because in the rulemaking process, A&R has implied that You can consider the need for housing, which VNRC agrees we need housing, and I'll get to that as I go through this. We don't dispute that there's a housing crisis as part of the debate and discussion we've been having about Act 181 and the Home Act and all the other laws. But the way this statute is set up is recognizing the natural importance ecologically of wetlands, is saying that we need to protect them, we need to restore them, we need to make decisions based on how we protect and restore them on science, and make sure that there's a net benefit to the people of the state. And the only way I could read that is that a net environmental benefit. I mean, there are other societal issues for sure, and housing is one of them, but that's not the point of the statute, is to allow degradation of these really miraculous natural resources to solve other problems that are real that the state of Vermont has. So that is one reason why I think this is a major departure. Another reason is you heard a discussion about what the agency is trying to do in the statute, and what they've proposed to do in the rule is to create an allowed use for the building of housing. So it's a type of development to fill wetlands that are significant. So they don't dispute that these are significant wetlands. There's no dispute. The agency is not saying that these wetlands don't merit protection, that they don't fall under the umbrella of those words that said we need to protect and restore wetlands and manage the wetlands based on science. The agency is acknowledging that the wetlands that would be built in, that the functions would be either eliminated or diminished, are significant, but they're basically saying it could be an allowed use for a type of development. And the dispute that we're going to have in Elkhart, and I think what the agency is trying to rectify that with this statute, I think what the agency is trying to do is, as I think General Counsel Gessing indicated that, and I think Neil Kamen said this when he testified, is that there are issues that have been raised about the authority. What's the purpose of the statute, as I just went through it? And could the agency create an allowed use for a type of building that would definitely not protect and restore wetlands? It will harm wetlands and harm wetland functions. Catherine, General Counsel Gessing, basically said that there are other allowed uses in the statute, and that is true. There are a lot of allowed uses in the statute. I encourage you to read them. They're mostly really small things, like de minimis things, like mowing lawn in a wetland buffer, putting a barbecue pit in a wetland buffer, maybe even in the wetland. I'm not even sure about that. There are allowed uses for growing crops, but that's associated with the exemption for farming and the fact that there are required agricultural practices for farming that we rely on to protect wetlands. So it's not as if under those allowed uses, we say, oh, you could do anything you want in the wetlands. It's either really small or there are other regulations in place to protect the wetland. Same thing like for utilities. There's some allowed uses, but they have to have BMPs. So it's not saying, and they're also sort of limited because they're linear projects. So there's no precedent. This is unprecedented to go into this statute with the purpose is to protect and restore wetlands guided by science, to basically say, well, for this type of building, which could have a very large footprint, it's, the way they define housing, it could be a small footprint, it could be a McMansion. We really don't know. And so this is a big deal. I think it's interesting, and we'll have the debate in Elkhart about whether by time limiting this allowed use and restricting it to an area is consistent with so Elkhart, as you probably know, like the main things they look at is a proposed rule meet legislative intent of the statute? Is it contrary to law, or does the agency have the authority to promulgate it? And I think that's a debate we're going to have is, could this be an allowed use like those other allowed uses I described? Is it consistent with protecting wetlands based on science, or is it out of bounds? This amendment would basically clear that up. If the committee were to adopt it, it would say, well, we're legalizing this essentially. So it's a big decision for you all to make, to legalize this, is the long way around the barn point that I'm trying to make at the start. So I want to address some of the rationales that A&R has put forward for, why you should change the statute, why you should resolve this legal dispute that we have about whether the authority exists and whether this is the right policy. So first, the agency is saying it's basically implementing the governor's executive order that's recognizing that we have a housing crisis. As I said, VNRC agrees that we have a housing crisis. But we believe that you will not be helping people who need housing by doing this, because you'll put, as the committee has discussed this morning, people in harm's way because you allow building in wet areas, right in wetlands. You could build in part of a wetland, all of the wetland. Obviously, building in wet areas is not good for structure and infrastructure. It could create certainly damage during flood events. It could just create mold and other issues related to building in wet areas over time. And I really disagree with the notion that there are other permits that mitigate the risk. So the permits that were mentioned were stormwater permits. So a stormwater permit, first of all, is only required if you're creating a half acre of impervious surface. So you could basically build in up to a half acre of a wetland and then never get a stormwater permit. So that would not help. I guess the theory is that you'd be replacing the natural functions of wetlands to do flood control, filter out pollutants, and replace it with the built environment. That is absolutely, and you can have Karina Daly is going to testify tomorrow. She could speak to this more, but you could have like TNC, Nature Conservancy has done a lot of work on this. The movement in this country and over the last 30 years is to be moving away from replacing the nature's way of dealing with flood issues and erosion and water quality with infrastructure and not have the problem that I mentioned in Chittenden County. That's what we did in Chittenden County, right? So we eliminated a lot of wetlands, and what did we do? Now we built stormwater systems all over the place, really expensive stormwater systems, which is another question I have. Like, are you really helping with affordability if you're basically relying on people to build housing to get more expensive stormwater permits to replace the functions of the wetlands where the functions were either eliminated or diminished? Like, this is the opposite. I thought we made a lot of progress in the sustainable building and sustainability, movement in this country, because I thought there was broad agreement amongst engineers and builders and environmentalists that we don't want to do what we did like after World War II, when we came back from the war and we built all over the place and we just built in wetlands and we didn't put initially stormwater controls in, then we had to retrofit it all. And it just seems to me like this is really short-sighted, which gets to like the other thing that I heard this morning, which is I heard from A&R, well, we have a short-term housing crisis. The question was, I forget who asked, it was a great question. It's like, what are the long-term risks? Well, we don't know, but we know we have a short-term housing problem. So let's do that. And then we'll see what happens like down the road, because it's more important to build housing. But again, it gets back to my point, like VNRC is all for building more dense housing, the Home Act, Act 181, all of the discussions we had, but I don't think it helps people if they're going to be long-term risks to flooding and erosion, etc. The other permit that was mentioned was the stream alteration permit. Stream alteration permits are permits for in-stream work. It's like when you're building a bridge abutment or you're putting in a culvert. So you're going into the stream and you're creating disturbance. And yes, you have to make sure you do it in a way that doesn't create, undue erosion while you're doing that work. It doesn't affect aquatic habitat and fish. That has nothing to do with the long-term loss of flood storage functions and erosion control and filtering pollutants. That just won't help at all. And these wetlands may be near streams. They may not be, as we know. They could be 100 feet or more, but they're in this little sub-watershed where they are performing the functions that we've talked about. So I just don't see how that helps. And even the River Corridor program, when it gets up and running, and Representative Chapin made the good point that it's not. So there's certainly wetlands that are right in those river corridors or adjacent to them now. But a lot of the flooding that we saw over the last few summers in Lindenville, in Plainfield, in Cabot, in Barry, those were not like in the river corridors. They were up in the hills near smaller tributaries that got blown out when we got those intense rain events. And wetlands help with that. And you would be allowing people to just build in those areas. And so I don't think so some things may get captured by the river corridor program, but not everything, I think. And that is really sort of the incredible functions that wetland provide, that they're up in these little sub watersheds. And again, I thought that we learned this lesson, a long time ago. So I just don't think this is going to help. Another argument that the ANR makes in support of this is that, well, it's a small amount of area. It's a small percentage of acreage. And so, we're going to have full protection for the wetlands that are not in these areas. And this is just a small area. So overall, whatever we lose, it won't be that impactful. Again, I disagree. I think first of all, these areas are where the densest developments are. So there are more people living in these areas. So even though it's a smaller amount of acreage, it affects a lot of people, because all of the growth areas that they've listed is where we have the densest development in the state. So while it may be a small amount of acreage, a lot of people live in these areas and could be affected by the loss of flood storage, erosion control. And then water quality is just, it gets you to the stormwater, and you could end up impairing waters, certainly degrading waters. Ironically, the underlying part of this bill is to talk about anti-degradation and come up with a policy that we don't have to make sure that we don't degrade waters that are meeting or exceeding water quality standards. This is going to put waters at risk that meet or exceed water quality standards. So that's not a risk to homes and people and infrastructure, but it is a risk to water quality. And again, I don't see the justification for doing this major shift in how we deal with wetlands, and basically saying, well, and I think that the fact that it's termed is sort of an acknowledgement that we don't want to do this for the long term, that we're just going to make this a short-term thing. That doesn't give me any comfort. And I am really concerned about the precedent that this sets. Like, if we start opening up our environmental laws to allow degradation to meet a short-term problem, in a way that won't even, I don't think, solve that problem for all the reasons that I stated, I think it's a slippery slope towards, opening up a lot of statutes, or having the debate about opening up a lot of statutes. And I don't think that's time well spent by the legislature and all the different stakeholders that you're going to hear from. And I think we would be better served by trying to find other solutions. A couple other points that I wanted to make. I'm glad that General Counsel Gessing acknowledged it was a good question about, well, how many wetlands are unmapped? Another premise of this amendment is like, well, it's only the unmapped wetlands. As I said, ANR is not saying they're not significant, they're not important. They're just saying, well, they're not on the map. General Counsel Gessing did acknowledge on ANR's own website, it says 39% of Vermont wetlands may not be mapped. That's what the website says. I don't dispute that there's been more mapping that has been done. But we don't know. We don't know how much that gap is closed. I also think it's concerning that we don't really know where these wetlands are and what functions they provide. And so we're really going in blind in terms of what the impact is going to be. I want to talk a little bit about the buffer, and then the last thing I have to say is about the wetland delineation certification and the general permit. So the wetland buffer. So as noted, statute requires a 50-foot buffer minimum. It could be adjusted, as General Counsel Gessing indicated, but it has to be based on science. Adjusting the buffer goes back to the purpose of the statute that I read at the very beginning, that we make decisions under the Vermont law on protecting and restoring wetlands based on science. And so the A&R secretary can only right now, under the law, adjust a buffer if there's evidence, scientific evidence, that the functions and values the buffer provides could be either less than 50 feet or greater than 50 feet. It could go either way. It's a fact-based decision. When I was the director of the Water Resources Board, we saw a number of requests to reclassify wetlands, to shift buffers, and we did this scientific functions and values review. It is a real departure. What the statute would do is say, these are for mapped wetlands. For mapped wetlands, we're just going to make the buffer 25 feet. We're just going to cut it in half. We don't know where these wetlands are. We don't know what functions they provide. We don't know what the harm might come ecologically or to structures or infrastructure. We're just going to have it. That is a really significant departure from a science-based approach to adjusting the buffer that we have in law that I think has served us well. It is not an arduous process to adjust the buffer. You petition, you write a letter to the A&R secretary, it goes to the Wetlands Division, they look at it, and they make an informed decision on whether we should adjust the buffer. Really oppose the idea that we're not going to make informed decisions and we're just going to arbitrarily, I think it's like the very definition of arbitrary, just cut the buffer in half when, and Karina could speak to this better tomorrow, all the science is that the 50 foot is a minimum. Look at the science, and I urge you to, Karina will go through this, but you could ask A&R about this, and there's a lot of information out there, but 50 foot is widely recognized as not being sufficient to protect functions and values of wetlands. And now we're just cutting it in half without understanding at all what the functions and values are and how they're going to be affected. So that's what I have on that part of the bill. And obviously, VNRC does not support moving forward with that for all the reasons that I stated, but I'm happy to answer any questions about that. Or I talk a little bit, and I have much less to say about the general permit and wetland delineation because it's going to be covered tomorrow more, but I could give some overarching thoughts, but I'm happy. I don't know if there are any questions about that part of the bill.
I just want to say that out loud, I think a class 1 buffer is 100 feet. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
class 1 is 100, yeah.
And that my understanding is that 50 and 100 are in many instances considered ecologically very much minimums for protection of wetland function.
Yeah, as I said, they are. The science is really clear. And I learned that working at A&R and talking to the wetland scientists. They taught me that. So if you talk to them, I'm sure that they would say the same thing. And the 100-foot buffer for class 1 wetlands, and class 1 wetlands are they're extremely special wetlands. They have special characteristics. They are petitioned. They're not, you don't get a class 1 wetland unless A&R on its own or someone petitions for a class 1 wetland. VNRC's petition, I think, for 5 or 6 class 1 wetlands designations over the course of its history. And whenever you go through that process, the buffer is never 100 feet. It's so, because you really get a focus on what's needed. It's always more, and it's variable. We'll actually do the work because there's such special wetlands, like the Dorset Marsh is one. Even Burlington has the North Shore Wetland. They have a class 1 wetland. Anyway.
What do you think the rationale from the administration is to do this? Because my sense is we have enough land to build housing safely without impacting environmental protections. Do you have any sense about that? And can you also talk about what other benefits wetlands have other than the actual wetland? I mean, in terms of surrounding the wetland.
Well, I mean, clearly it's in response to the housing crisis. I think, as I said, I just don't think this is the right response. And I want to be crystal super clear that myself personally and VNRC agrees that we need more affordable housing in dense areas, but this isn't going to help. I don't know exactly what they're responding to. I just think that it's a mistake to do this. And again, I think by putting in the term limited, I think it's an acknowledgement that we should not do this over the long term. And I think that the committee has really talked about this in it's a risk analysis. And I guess A&R has decided that the leadership at A&R has decided this is worth the risk. And so they're going forward with it. VNRC is a environmental advocacy group that have been working on these issues for more than 60 years. Just it really don't thinks it's a big mistake to go in this direction, whatever their motivations are, and to adjust the statute in this way. And I think there are other things that we could do, like a general permit and like the delineation, like if we do them right. But this would be a mistake. Wetland functions, I mean, I think I've already, been very clear: flood storage, water quality, filtration, erosion control, but also wildlife habitat and habitat for especially migratory birds. And they're often a rare species of plants in wetlands because they're just ecologically really rich, diverse areas. They're often smaller wetlands that are not mapped usually because they're harder to find. I think when I talked about this at the beginning of the session, most of the core of the mapping was done originally from flyovers. So we missed a lot, right? You're like way up there. You're not going to get not even forested wetlands, but wetlands like in wooded areas. You're not going to get what they call vernal pools, which are wetlands, but they're only wet certain times of the year. But those are the resources where you get the amphibians that migrate right now. Like the frogs are, and salamanders are leaping out of the vernal pools. Those will be there are no vernal pools in the woods of these growth areas. And some of the growth areas are pretty wide, like growth centers. So it's not just downtowns and village centers, but in growth areas, new town centers, which are part of this, you're definitely going to have some vernal pools that are not mapped. They could be filled. And that would be legal if this amendment would pass. And then the sewer extension areas, even make it wider. So you could get into some of those issues. I've been trying to focus on kind of the core water quality issues because I think it's the most visual depiction of what you could lose. But yes, there are all those functions as well.
Representative Taglivia, then North.
I think a lot of what you were talking about was worst case scenario. Let's try to go to best case scenario where there's a reduction of a buffer from 50 to 25 feet. How, or is it possible that some sort of mitigation can be done so that certain projects are able to connect to infrastructure that's necessary? Like you said, some of these growth areas, there already is density. That's one of the reasons why I think the governor's EO exists. In a best case scenario, how hard is it to do mitigation to allow for both?
I mean, it's case specific, but you could do mitigation. But this is not a proposal for mitigation. This is a proposal for impacts and not reviewing the impacts or mitigating them. So I think the general permit approach would allow for some analysis and review and some mitigation. But the amendment, this part of the amendment we've been talking about, it just basically says you could build and you don't address impacts because you don't have to. The law wouldn't require it.
Representative North.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. That's John for your testimony today. Does this amendment affect Class 1 wetlands and their buffers?
No.
If we just look at sections 1 and 2, which are basically the codification of the governor's EO, do these sections, just these sections of this amendment, allow for building a house inside Class 1 wetland or its boundaries, or a mapped Class 2 wetland and its 25-foot buffer?
No, not Class 1 as we just discussed. And yeah, under the map wetlands, you still need a permit to work within a Class 2 wetland or a 25-foot buffer. This is just unmapped wetlands. And then having the buffer that's the buffer that's in law right now. Yeah.
So have you done any estimates of how many acres are included? If we also, I guess, included in those current sections 1 and 2, is development is just, as you noted, within those designated areas or growth areas. I don't know if you had the ability to do any calculation of that 25-foot ribbon around the mapped areas and how much area that actually is.
What's less? I have not.
Designated area.
I'm not. I'll ask Karina if she has thought about it, if she wants to look. And the agency would obviously be, they have the best information. And I guess I would argue that is their burden because they want to make this change to make the case. And I haven't heard that from them.
That's the only difference we're talking about. We're still not, this amendment still is not saying, yeah, go ahead and build a house in the middle of the wetland or even.
It is for unmapped wetlands that are significant, but not for the map wetlands.
Right.
But there are unmapped wetlands that will be filled and
25-foot ribbon that we're talking about.
Well,
for the map wetlands, yeah.
and an unknown amount of unmapped wetlands.
Right.
Within those.
Right.
Within those growth areas. Designated.
Which A&R said they don't know how many are there. And that's one of we did have lots of conversations with A&R about this. And we did say we asked A&R rather than, the proposal for building in unmapped wetlands and having the buffer for map wetlands to work on things like the general permit and the delineator issue. We haven't gotten into the details with them though yet, because we but we do think that those are better ways to approach this because you could streamline or make more efficient the process without like giving up functions that could help people in the environment.
One more follow-up question. So if the focus is just on these designated areas and the potentially unmapped wetlands within those areas, how long, if we focused on our mapping efforts on those designated areas, which are like 2.3% of Vermont's lands, how quickly could we get through that mapping process? So they would all.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great question. I don't know how quickly, but I think pretty quickly. And we have talked with A&R about that too. And I think we talked about it earlier in the session and I do think that's one of the things that's frustrating about us because we made a lot of progress. And part of this was in Act 121, right? Isn't part of Act 121, the Flood Safety Act, is to do better, to put more resources into mapping and to expedite the mapping. Because yes, I think that is ultimately the best answer, right? Yeah, to close that gap. And I think you should ask A&R, like General Counsel Gessing mentioned that I think she says something like 150 towns have submitted information. One thing that we did identify in talks with A&R is that a lot of towns, conservation commissions in particular, have done this mapping and there's data that information has been submitted to A&R, but it's not resulted in those wetlands getting on the maps because they have a process. So we talked about how could we expedite that? How could we get that? If you look at the Natural Resources Atlas right now or Vermont Conservation Design, there's a layer of so there's a wetland map layer, then there's another layer about pending, so that you could see where a lot of that is. But they're not officially on the map. I think we should expedite that. I think that would be a good thing to do.
So are pending mapped or not mapped?
They have been mapped, but they haven't been approved.
I mean, under this scenario, would they count as unmapped?
They'd be unmapped because they're not official.
Yeah. And I just want to make the point that there's really only a handful of Class 1 wetlands in the state. There are many others that could qualify, but it's a cumbersome process and it certainly hasn't been a priority recently. So there are very few Class 1 wetlands.
Yeah, they're very few.
Um,
They're beautiful though. You should go see them. Peach and Bog, I think, was one of the last one. It's near me. That's on state land. It's not really at risk of anything, but pretty beautiful.
Representative, Sakowitz and then Tagliavia.
Yeah, in the context of the amount of acreage of wetlands and wetland buffers that we're talking about, I guess it sounds like the truth is we don't really know, but I'm not sure that it matters that much because if the amount of area that we're talking about is truly small, then it seems like this is a pretty heavy thing to do for such a small amount of land that would be involved. Like, why are we bothering? But if we're talking about really significant amounts of acreage that would be affected, then we have all the problems that Mr. Groveman has so, laid out for us so nicely. And so it seems like no matter how much land is being affected, this seems like a really wrong-headed approach.
Representative Tagliavia.
I wanted to give the deputy commissioner.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of own something. I don't think there's any instance where we put a home up where there wasn't a home before, where we've improved the environmental conditions in that location. It will never happen. That environmental silver bullet doesn't exist. So there is an acceptance of detriment when we provide additional enabling regulations for housing anywhere. There will always be a detriment when a home goes up where there was not a home before. I've seen the same conversation for 10 years where we've been trying to find this silver bullet legislation where there's no detrimental impact and we build a bunch of houses. Contrary to Mr. Groveman's performative overcharacterization of us trying to do a post-World War II housing boom with this amendment, it would not do that. It's limited in scope and would add some additional units to some key developments, particularly at Prospect Heights, and I'm sure elsewhere in the state if we were to do that analysis. So this is targeted, it's thoughtful. It's not intended to throw caution to the wind and put people in harm's way. There are a lot of other permits that and a lot of other local considerations that would mitigate those concerns.
Can I respond? So I did not say that we're trying to do a post-World War II housing boom. I was saying that when that happened, it had a really detrimental impact on water quality and we lost a lot of wetlands. And that we don't want to repeat those mistakes, or we've learned from that and we stopped doing that. And I think the Deputy Secretary is incorrect, because if you go through a permit process under the law, you have to avoid, minimize, mitigate, and now because of Act 121, you have to compensate to achieve the net gain. So you don't just kind of give up and say, well, you have to put, yes, of course, there could be some degradation, but it is minimized. It is avoided, minimized, mitigated, or compensated from. And if you don't go through that process, then you're doing none of that. And you could legally just build right in a wetland, and A&R is not going to look at it. And, there's nowhere that towns have their own comprehensive wetland regulations process. And as I said, stormwater permits and stream alteration permits and wastewater permits and the other permits that you might have to get don't make up. And it does not address those issues.
And I guess I just want to add that we're trying to build livable, densely populated communities. People enjoy contact with nature. In addition to the other benefits of functioning wetlands and functioning river corridors for the built environment, benefits that we've talked about, human beings are going to be living in these communities and they enjoy access to wildlife and outdoor spaces and vernal pools without having to get in their car and drive to a recreation area. So the vision here should be about a livable communities, not just as dense as we can make them. And I want to say, we thank you for testimony.
I'd just like to know, I've done this for a long time, and I don't make personal comments about people who are testifying and how they are doing that. And I hope the committee will, I think we could disagree and have different opinions, and we could have debates about what information and arguments, but I'm really surprised by that. I haven't experienced that. I've been doing this work for over 30 years. So
thank you for that reminder about decorum and how we try to have conversations in this room. Super important.
Just quickly. I want to say that I want to go back to what you said about science. I like hearing people's opinions, but that's what they are. And for me, I'm looking at data and science. What is the science? What is the data? So I just want to clarify, I'm not really interested in hearing people's opinions unless I have data to back it up.
fair enough.
Folks, we're going to take a 2-minute break. Sorry, this time we are pressed for time, I think, because we're going to hear a repeat of yesterday's amendments before lunch, I hope. But the Judiciary Committee has it now, and we have our counsel to walk through S325 with us. So, okay.
Okay.
Well,
Okay.
we'll take a 2-minute break. Stand up.